I just think that Oscar Micheaux is one of the great filmmakers of the silent period. You know, I would put him with Chaplin, von Stroheim, Eisenstein, Vertov. I mean, you know, you could list, you know, maybe 10 of the greatest, filmmakers, Germain Dulac, and I would just put him there. For a long time, the only silent film by Oscar Micheaux that survived was Body and Soul, which was this film that was sort of seen as a problematic print. We had gone through a series of censorships. There were maybe a couple variant prints, some of which really were horrific on every level, quality and otherwise. You couldn't really get any sense of what the film was really about. But then not only was there a print of Body and Soul at the Eastman House that I think was becoming more available, but also 2 other silent Micheaux films emerged on the scene. And interestingly, they both came from European archives. One, Symbol of the Unconquered, which had French and Flemish intertitles, came from the Belgian Film Archive, and the other, Within Our Gates, had Spanish intertitles and came from the Spanish archive. So suddenly, instead of one film of problematic status, we had 3, and meanwhile this formerly problematic film looked more and more complete if you sort of compared the length of the actual film to what was being advertised and sold at the time, and there wasn't, in fact, that much missing. I mean, the thing about Micheaux is that the subject or the stories are only like the starting point. He's really a radical formalist in so many ways, and how he organizes his stories. You know, Within Our Gates, we almost get to the end, and the couple can't get together because of her unspoken past. The lover doesn't know about. And so just as we're at the end of the film, we get this long flashback, a 25, 30-minute flashback explicating her whole history. And there's a flashback within that flashback. In fact, there's multiple flashbacks, some of which have been removed because of censorship. But there's little traces of, you can find them in the newspapers to understand that those things are missing, and others, there's little pieces left. And so it's only after these flashbacks, that you can get back to the couple and they can actually get together. You know, not that flashbacks are unheard of, or not that dream sequences are unheard of, but he just did it in such a profound, radical way that without the film, you're really speculating. I mean, you know that he made a film version of The House Behind the Cedars or something like that, and you know, our film version of one of his own novels. But you know, what we need to do is see the films, and we can only hope that somehow, eventually, 1 or 2 more of his silent films will show up. The thing about Symbol of the Unconquered is that it is much more of a fragment, right? Now, most silent films, we have to admit, are not absolutely complete. You know, Scar of Shame, for instance, the wedding sequence was missing from a print for a long time, and then they discovered it. And this is happening all the time. This is why there's endless restorations of silent films. But you know, Within Our Gates is missing at least one major flashback and some other things, but nonetheless, I think its integrity is pretty much there. And that's, I think, true with Body and Soul. But Symbol of the Unconquered is a little more of a fragment. I mean, it's somewhere between a fragment and a complete film, or a complete enough film, I should say. But still, there's that frustration that maybe there's a lot more in there that we just don't know about. He was someone that people in the Harlem Renaissance never mentioned. On any occasion, he was completely unacceptable for this literati, and in fact, you know, his films would very often attack the literati. I mean, one person he really went after in a number of different films and novels was W.E.B. Du Bois. Within Our Gates, for instance, I think is a covert engagement with Du Bois's The Silver Fleece, his novel from 1913. The thing about Micheaux, and I don't think we've even gotten to the bottom of it, is there's this, that his films are this rich engagement with a number of important cultural texts at any given moment. And they become invisible to us, and they have become invisible to us. And the challenge is really to resensitize ourselves to the milieu of African American culture in which these films were made, and which he felt so passionately about. Body and Soul was not only a reworking or working against Emperor Jones, it was also an engagement with another Eugene O'Neill play, All God's Children's Got Wings, which Robeson also appeared in, and then finally Roseanne. So here were three plays about the black soul, all by white playwrights that featured Paul Robeson, and Oscar Micheaux, just had no use for this. And so he made Body and Soul, and he even got Robeson to appear in it. And I think Robeson very clearly, in retrospect, understood that he was being made to make fun of himself or to criticize himself, that he had been outwitted, if you will, by Micheaux. And so he never mentioned the film whenever he talked about his film work. And in fact, the AFI catalog for Emperor Jones at one point said, and probably may still say, Emperor Jones was Paul Robeson's first film. Paul Robeson Jr., Paul Robeson's son, insisted that that was not his father. There's all this evidence that's very clear that it was Paul Robeson, but there was just a willful effort to resist it. And the response to the film also at the time was very divided. Some people absolutely hated it. New York censors gave it a very hard time. And then other people sort of recognized it. But this, I think, was actually sort of Micheaux's fate. That people critics would often hate his most recent film and remember the good old Oscar Micheaux of the good old days, whether it was like in the early 1920s or when he began to make sound films in the early 1930s. They would think about the good old days of Oscar Micheaux's silent films from the late 20s, which they had, 5 years earlier, viciously attacked. There are the people who love and adore the sound films, like Jay Hoberman, who thinks 10 Minutes to Live is one of the great films of all time, and just Micheaux at his baddest, and there's a way in which the badder you get, the more good you are. He did have certain kinds of constraints with the sound films. He had obvious constraints with silent cinema, but once you're talking about sound, the equipment, you don't own the equipment, you have to rent it, you have to go into studios, the studio rentals are expensive.
Oh, will you hush? For God's sake, hush!
So everything has become much more expensive, and your audience has not gotten any bigger. There were, of course, certain advantages to sound in terms of being able to have music and song and dance in a way that didn't work in the silent period. So, maybe that provided some kind of compensation, but I still think that, it constrained Micheaux in certain ways that was not the case in the silent period. Micheaux's films don't necessarily open themselves up immediately to understanding, appreciation. If you want to think of Micheaux as trying to make, the well-made Hollywood film, he seems to be like totally inept and crazy and like he doesn't know what he's doing. But if you give him the benefit of the doubt, if you try and understand what he wanted to do rather than judging him against other standards, you begin to see that in fact, his films are incredibly rich and dense and fascinating and an amazing cultural accomplishment.